Weakness is never dramatic. It does not arrive screaming in moments of violence or reveal itself during open conflict. It waits patiently, quietly, in places most men never look. It hides in comfort, in routine, in the belief that tomorrow will offer another chance. Weakness lives in the pause between intention and action, in the hesitation that feels reasonable, in the internal negotiation that delays movement by just a fraction of a second. That fraction is where outcomes are decided. The samurai understood this long before modern language tried to explain it. They knew that battles are not lost when the blade breaks, but when the spirit hesitates. The path of Bushido was never about serenity or inner peace as it is often romanticized today. It was a path of pressure, of exposure, of deliberately placing oneself where excuses cannot survive. Fire does not cleanse what it never touches, and discipline does not strengthen what refuses resistance. A spirit that avoids hardship becomes fragile, no matter how polished it appears. Miyamoto Musashi emerged from an age where survival itself was uncertain, where war was not an event but a constant presence. Born in 1584, he did not inherit certainty, status, or safety. What he inherited was chaos, and from that chaos he carved clarity. Musashi did not wait for mentors to save him or systems to shape him. He retreated into solitude, not to escape the world, but to strip himself of illusion. Day after day, he trained without applause, without validation, without reassurance that his efforts would ever be recognized. Sword in hand, brush in the other, he forged his mind and body simultaneously, understanding that technique without philosophy collapses under fear, and philosophy without action dissolves into fantasy. In his final days, as death approached not as an enemy but as a certainty, he wrote words that cut deeper than any blade: think lightly of yourself and deeply of the world. This was not humility in the modern sense. It was strategy. The self is noisy. It demands comfort, praise, certainty, and escape. It invents stories to protect itself from discomfort. The world, however, is silent and indifferent. Rivers do not slow for doubt. Mountains do not bend for fear. Reality does not negotiate. To live disciplined is to align with this truth rather than resist it. This story is not offered as inspiration or legend. It is a reckoning. It exposes why so many train, plan, prepare, and still fail when pressure arrives. It reveals why surface-level discipline creates performers, not warriors. What follows is not designed to make you feel strong, but to show you where you are weak, because only what is exposed can be reforged. The disciplines hidden by the samurai were never hidden by secrecy, but by difficulty. Most people simply refuse to live them. The young samurai looked perfect from the outside, and that was precisely the problem. In the spring of 1612, in Osaka province, Teshi of the Hayashi clan stepped into the dueling circle carrying the weight of expectation like armor. He was 22, born into privilege, raised on tradition, sharpened by 15 years of daily training. His posture was flawless, his grip precise, his footwork praised by every instructor who had ever guided him. To the crowd of 300 witnesses, he represented everything a warrior should be. His opponent did not. The Ronin who stood across from him carried no banner, no lineage, no reputation. His clothes were worn, his wooden sword chipped and stained by years of use. He did not bow deeply. He did not assume a polished stance. He simply stood, eyes half closed, breathing slow, as if the duel were an inconvenience rather than a test of life and honor. When the signal was given, Teshi raised his blade exactly as he had been taught, executing perfection down to the smallest detail. And then nothing happened. The Ronin did not move. No strike, no feint, no aggression. Seconds stretched into something unbearable. Teshi's mind, trained in forms and sequences, began searching for instruction. Was this a trick? Should he attack first? His sensei's voice echoed in memory, warning against reckless initiative. That single moment of internal debate fractured him. Before thought could settle into action, the Ronin moved. One step, one strike, clean and absolute. Teshi's sword left his hands and skidded across the ground. 3 breaths. That was all it took. The duel was over before it had truly begun. Silence followed, heavier than mockery. In that silence, Teshi understood something far more devastating than defeat. His years of preparation had evaporated the instant pressure demanded decision. His training had taught him how to perform, not how to act when certainty vanished. Technique had abandoned him because his mind had frozen. That night, shame burned hotter than anger. He did not return home. He did not defend his honor with words. He left Osaka without destination, carrying nothing but confusion and the echo of whispers behind him. 3 days later, deep in the mountains, he found a small, forgotten shrine. And there, seated as if the world had arranged it deliberately, was the Ronin who had defeated him. Rage surged first, then humiliation, but beneath both lay a sharper force, curiosity. When Teshi demanded answers, the Ronin did not rise. He did not mock him. He simply spoke the truth that Teshi could not escape. Your form is beautiful, he said, but beauty collapses under pressure. You hesitated. And hesitation is death. Those words cut deeper than steel because they were undeniable. The Ronin explained that discipline built for display shatters when fear enters the body. Real discipline is invisible. It exists before the movement, before emotion, before thought. It is what remains when the mind offers no guidance. When Teshi asked who he was, the Ronin answered simply, a wanderer who once trained under Miyamoto Musashi. And then came the offer that would dismantle everything Teshi believed about strength. If you are willing to unlearn what you know, I will teach you what cannot be taken from you. Not forms. Not techniques. Disciplines forged where excuses die. In that moment, Teshi knelt, not out of submission, but out of recognition that perfection had made him fragile. What stood before him was not a man who fought better, but a man who could not be shaken. And that, Teshi realized, was what he lacked. By the 7th day in the mountains, Teshi discovered that fatigue was not the enemy he had always believed it to be. What truly exhausted him was resistance. Each dawn before that had been a negotiation with himself, a quiet debate over comfort, pain, and entitlement. But under Kensei's watch, those negotiations were stripped away. The Ronin woke him before the sky changed color, his voice sharp and final. Stand. No explanation followed. No allowance for soreness or cold. Teshi's body protested violently, muscles stiff from the previous day's climb and relentless drills. Yet something in the command bypassed thought. He stood, not gracefully, not proudly, but immediately. Kensei watched without praise. This, he explained, was the first crack in the false foundation Teshi had lived upon. Discipline does not begin with effort, it begins with obedience to action. A man who debates with his own weakness has already surrendered ground. Each morning after that, Teshi learned to move before his mind could interfere. The habit was brutal. His thoughts screamed excuses, memories of status and entitlement surfaced, but none were allowed to slow the first motion of the day. As the days passed, Kensei shifted the lesson inward. One afternoon, he handed Teshi a wooden sword and instructed him to hold his stance. Then the words began. Carefully chosen, cruelly accurate. Insults about his family, his failure, the shame he had brought upon his name. Each sentence was a blade aimed not at flesh but at identity. Rage surged through Teshi, hot and blinding. His grip tightened, his posture leaned forward, instinct demanding retaliation. That was when Kensei lowered his weapon and stopped. You see, he said calmly, emotion now controls your body. I have not attacked you, yet you are already defeated. The realization struck hard. Teshi had always believed emotion fueled strength, that anger sharpened resolve. But here, under pressure, it fractured clarity. Kensei explained that emotion is movement without direction. It feels powerful, but it scatters attention and exposes openings. The disciplined warrior does not eliminate emotion, he refuses to be commanded by it. Over the following days, Teshi was tested relentlessly. Sudden shouts, unexpected strikes, verbal attacks meant to provoke fear or pride. Each time, emotion rose like a storm inside him, but he was taught to observe it without obeying it. Feel everything, Kensei said, but let nothing choose your action. Slowly, something profound changed. Teshi noticed that when he stopped reacting, time seemed to widen. Movements became clearer. Decisions arrived without force. He was no longer fighting himself before facing an opponent. In those moments of stillness, he understood why his perfect form had failed him in Osaka. It had been fueled by expectation and fear of loss. Here, stripped of witnesses and reputation, only the act itself remained. Kensei spoke of Musashi, not as legend, but as warning. Musashi survived dozens of duels not because he was fearless, but because he refused to let fear dictate motion. Others swung harder when angry. He swung cleaner. Others rushed to end the fight. He waited until the opening revealed itself. Teshi began to sense that true strength was quieter than he had imagined. It did not announce itself. It did not seek validation. It simply acted when action was required and remained still when stillness was wiser. By the end of that phase of training, Teshi could stand unmoved while insults echoed around him, his breath steady, his awareness intact. Emotion still existed, but it no longer owned him. For the first time, he felt something deeper than confidence. He felt reliability. And he realized that a warrior who can trust himself under pressure has already won half the battle before the first strike is ever thrown. The rain arrived without warning, turning the mountain paths into rivers of mud and stone, and with it came the lesson Teshi would remember long after the pain faded. He woke before dawn as he had learned to do, but this time his body rebelled with uncommon force. His muscles were swollen and aching, his joints stiff, his hands cracked from days of gripping wood and steel. Outside the shrine, the wind howled through the trees, and cold rain lashed the ground hard enough to sting exposed skin. A quieter voice rose inside him, reasonable and persuasive. One day of rest would not undo his progress. Even warriors needed recovery. Surely discipline did not mean self-destruction. For a long moment, Teshi sat motionless, wrapped in a thin cloth that passed for bedding, listening to the storm and the argument in his mind. Then Kensei's words from days earlier surfaced, uninvited and sharp. Training done only when desired is not discipline. It is convenience wearing armor. Teshi stood. The act felt heavier than lifting a blade. Each step toward the door demanded resolve. When he stepped into the rain, the cold shocked the breath from his lungs, but he kept moving. Outside, Kensei was already there, soaked through, calmly practicing his forms as if the storm were an illusion. No acknowledgement, no encouragement. Just example. They trained for hours in the rain. Feet slipped, hands numbed, water ran into Teshi's eyes, blurring vision. Every instinct screamed to stop. Yet the longer he continued, the more something inside him hardened. The discomfort did not disappear, but it lost its authority. When they finally stopped, Kensei spoke quietly, as if stating a fact rather than offering praise. This is the discipline most men never master. Train when you do not want to. Anyone can act when inspired. Very few can act when resistance dominates every thought. Teshi understood then that discipline was not about intensity, but consistency under adversity. Musashi had not forged his skill in perfect conditions. He trained in caves, in rain, in hunger, without audience or reward. Strength built in comfort collapses under pressure. Strength built in refusal endures. In the weeks that followed, the lessons deepened. Kensei turned his attention to Teshi's possessions, the remnants of his former identity brought from Osaka. Fine clothing, multiple swords, tokens of family status, books meant to impress rather than instruct. He looked at them without judgment and spoke plainly. You carry too much. Teshi protested internally. These were symbols of who he was. Kensei corrected him. They are symbols of who you are afraid to stop being. The fourth discipline was revealed not through combat, but subtraction. Eliminate the unnecessary. Preference breeds attachment. Attachment breeds fear. Fear clouds judgment. Musashi wandered with almost nothing because he refused to anchor his mind to objects that demanded protection. Over several days, Teshi reduced his belongings to what could fit in a small bundle. One sword. One set of clothes. A bowl. Nothing more. The effect was immediate and unsettling. Without objects to manage, his mind felt exposed, almost naked. But within that exposure came clarity. There was less to think about, less to guard, less to lose. Movement became simpler. Focus sharpened. Soon after came pain, unavoidable and instructive. During sparring, a strike landed hard against Teshi's ribs, knocking the breath from him. Instinct urged retreat, treatment, relief. Kensei ordered him to sit and remain still. Do not escape the pain. Sit with it. This was the fifth discipline. Pain was not an enemy to be eliminated, but information to be endured. Musashi did not numb pain. He observed it. He allowed it to exist without letting it dictate his actions. Teshi sat for hours, breath shallow, sensation screaming for attention. Slowly, the pain shifted. It did not vanish, but it lost its dominance. It became a signal rather than a tyrant. In that stillness, Teshi learned that fleeing discomfort creates weakness, while remaining within it builds resilience. By the end of that month, he no longer feared difficult days. He understood that resistance was the true training ground. Comfort had taught him nothing. Discomfort, embraced without negotiation, was forging him into something he had never been before. As the seasons shifted and the mountain air grew thinner, Kensei turned his attention to something Teshi had never considered part of training at all, his attention. One morning during meditation, Teshi found his mind drifting endlessly. Thoughts of his family's shame surfaced, then memories of the duel in Osaka, then imagined futures where he returned victorious. Each thought pulled him away before he even noticed. Suddenly Kensei struck the ground with his staff, the sharp sound echoing through the trees. Your focus is unguarded, he said. And anything unguarded will be invaded. This was the sixth discipline, one that Musashi valued above brute strength. Guard your focus like a fortress. Kensei explained that most men lose battles long before weapons clash. They lose them when their attention fractures, when the mind splits between past regrets and future fears. A divided mind cannot strike cleanly. Musashi wrote that to perceive what cannot be seen, the mind must be still and whole. You cannot do this while leaking attention in every direction. Teshi was instructed to practice single-point focus in everything. When walking, only walk. Feel each step, each shift of weight. When eating, only eat. No thoughts of training, no memories, no planning. When striking, strike with full presence, not anticipation. At first it felt impossible. The mind rebelled, constantly wandering. Each time it drifted, Kensei ordered him to return without frustration. Not anger. Not judgment. Simply return. Over weeks, something remarkable happened. The gaps between wandering thoughts grew shorter. Moments of complete presence began to appear, brief at first, then longer. In those moments, Teshi felt an unfamiliar calm, not emptiness, but sharp clarity. His movements became efficient, stripped of excess. He realized how much energy he had wasted living half-present. Focus, he learned, was not intensity but containment. Power returned not by doing more, but by leaking less. Soon after, Kensei introduced the seventh discipline, one that cut directly at Teshi's old identity. Live without needing approval. The test came unexpectedly when a group of traveling samurai passed through the mountains and recognized Teshi. Their laughter carried easily in the thin air. The Hayashi heir who froze in 3 breaths. The disgrace of Osaka. Once, those words would have pierced him deeply. He would have felt compelled to explain, to prove, to challenge. Instead, he continued training. The insults landed, but they found no hook. After the men left, Kensei spoke quietly. As long as you require others to confirm your worth, you belong to them. Approval is a leash disguised as honor. Musashi walked alone not out of bitterness, but freedom. He refused to bend his path for witnesses. Teshi reflected on this deeply. His earlier discipline had been built on being seen as excellent. When that image shattered, so did his confidence. Now he understood. True discipline is private. Would you still train if no one ever praised you? Would you still walk this path if your name was forgotten? Over time, Teshi discovered an unexpected strength in obscurity. Training without audience removed performance. What remained was pure commitment to the path itself. Then came the eighth discipline, subtle but relentless. Control all things. Kensei explained that discipline was not reserved for the training ground. It governed eating, speaking, resting. The man who controls his sword but not his appetite is undisciplined. Teshi learned to eat simply, stopping before fullness dulled his senses. He learned to speak less, understanding that unnecessary words scattered energy. Silence became a form of strength. Even rest was structured, entered deliberately rather than collapsed into. Discipline, he realized, was sovereignty over small actions repeated daily. In controlling these seemingly minor habits, Teshi felt his inner order solidify. His days no longer felt chaotic. They moved with rhythm. The mind that once raced ahead or clung behind now stayed where his body was. By the end of that season, Teshi understood that these disciplines were not restrictions. They were liberations. Each one removed another chain he had mistaken for identity. With fewer attachments, fewer distractions, and no hunger for approval, his strength no longer depended on circumstance. It came from within, steady and unyielding, like the mountain itself. By the 6th month of training, Kensei brought Teshi to the edge of a sheer cliff where the wind rose sharply from below and the rocks disappeared into mist. Teshi's steps slowed as he approached, his body reacting before thought could intervene. Kensei stopped beside him and spoke with a calm that felt heavier than any shout. This is the 9th discipline. Accept death daily. Teshi's breath tightened. He had faced blades, pain, exhaustion, and humiliation, but this felt different. It was not an enemy in front of him, but the truth beneath him. Kensei explained that most men live as if time were endless, postponing courage, delaying action, bargaining with life as though tomorrow were guaranteed. This illusion, he said, is the root of weakness. Musashi wrote that one must think of death in the morning and evening, not to become fearful, but to destroy fear itself. When death is denied, it stalks you. When it is accepted, it frees you. Teshi stood at the edge, heart pounding, not because he intended to jump, but because his body recognized how fragile existence truly was. Kensei continued. Every hesitation you have ever felt was a negotiation with death. Every excuse was an attempt to forget it. But when you accept that this breath could be your last, you stop wasting it. Teshi was instructed to bow toward the void, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. From that day forward, each morning began with a quiet recognition, this day is not promised. Let it be lived correctly. The effect was immediate and profound. Procrastination lost its grip. Fear of embarrassment weakened. Decisions became simpler. If today might be the last, there was no reason to delay what mattered. Fear did not disappear, but it no longer controlled him. Shortly after, Kensei introduced the final discipline, one forged not in words but in consequence. Hold the line no matter what. This teaching was not explained at first. It arrived in the form of violence. One night, bandits descended on the mountain shrine seeking food and valuables. 7 men surrounded the clearing, blades drawn, confident in their numbers. Teshi felt the old instinct surge, the urge to flee, to calculate survival. But something else rose faster. Training. Kensei stepped forward and spoke once. This is why you trained. Hold the line. There was no plan discussed, no reassurance offered. Only presence. Only commitment. When the bandits attacked, Teshi did not think. He moved. Rising without negotiation, his body responded before fear could speak. Emotion surged, but it did not steer him. Pain arrived, sharp and real, but he did not flee it. Focus narrowed until only what mattered remained. He did not fight to prove himself, nor for approval, nor even for victory. He fought because retreat was not an option. The line existed, and it would not be crossed. In those moments, all 10 disciplines fused into one action. There was no separation between training and life, between teaching and doing. When the clash ended, the shrine still stood untouched. Some attackers lay unconscious. Others had fled. Teshi realized his feet had not moved backward even once. Kensei looked at him, eyes steady. Now you understand. Discipline is not something you use when convenient. It is who you are when there is nowhere left to run. That night, Teshi sat alone beneath the stars, body aching, mind clear. He understood that the final discipline was not about bravery in battle. It was about refusing to abandon yourself when pressure demands it most. Holding the line meant remaining aligned with the path regardless of cost. From that moment forward, Teshi no longer measured himself by outcomes. He measured himself by one question alone: did I remain? In that answer, he found an unshakable foundation, one that neither fear nor failure could erode. In the months that followed the night of the bandits, something subtle but irreversible changed within Teshi. The urgency that once drove him had dissolved into steadiness. He no longer trained with the desperation of a man trying to erase shame, nor with the hunger for recognition that had once defined his youth. Training became quieter, deeper, almost invisible from the outside. Kensei explained that this was the 7th discipline fully taking root, living without the need for approval. Teshi had been born into status, raised on praise, shaped by expectation. Every movement in his early life had been measured against how it would be seen. Victory meant applause. Failure meant disgrace. Now, stripped of witnesses, stripped of reputation, stripped even of the desire to be acknowledged, he began to understand freedom. One afternoon, a group of traveling samurai passed through the mountain path and paused to watch him train. They recognized his name, whispered about his past defeat, laughed openly at the idea of a fallen heir hiding in the mountains. The old Teshi would have reacted instantly, challenged them, demanded respect. Instead, he continued his practice as if they were wind through trees. The laughter faded. The men moved on, unsettled not by defiance, but by irrelevance. Kensei later spoke of this moment as a turning point. As long as your strength depends on being seen, it can be taken from you. Approval is a leash disguised as reward. When you cut it, you move freely. Teshi reflected on Musashi's solitary life, misunderstood, criticized, often dismissed. Yet Musashi never adjusted his path to satisfy observers. He walked alone not because he despised others, but because his discipline answered to something higher than opinion. Alongside this, the 8th discipline began to shape Teshi's daily life: control all things. Discipline was no longer confined to the training ground. It extended to eating, speaking, resting. Meals became simple, intentional, eaten without excess or distraction. Words became fewer, chosen for clarity rather than comfort. Silence replaced unnecessary conversation. Even rest was approached deliberately, entered with awareness instead of collapse. Kensei taught that a man who trains fiercely but lives carelessly is divided against himself. Control must be total, not oppressive, but sovereign. Teshi began to see patterns he had once ignored. How careless speech drained energy. How indulgence dulled awareness. How scattered habits weakened resolve. By bringing order to these small acts, his larger actions gained force. The ninth discipline, acceptance of death, continued to deepen. Each morning, Teshi acknowledged impermanence, not with dread, but with clarity. This awareness sharpened his presence. Conversations felt more honest. Training felt more urgent. There was no sense of rushing, only precision. Life was no longer something to postpone. It was something to meet fully, without delay. Kensei observed silently as Teshi moved through these changes, intervening less and less. One evening, as they sat watching the sun fall behind the mountains, Kensei finally spoke. "You no longer need me in the way you once did." Teshi understood. The disciplines were no longer rules he followed. They had become instincts. Approval no longer motivated him. Control no longer felt forced. Death no longer frightened him. The inner fortress was complete. And within that fortress, Teshi found a calm strength that did not demand validation, did not fear loss, and did not depend on circumstance. He had stopped trying to become a warrior. He had begun to live as one. The true measure of Teshi's transformation revealed itself not in battle, but in continuity. Seasons passed, and the mountain shrine remained unchanged, yet Teshi did not. He moved through each day with a consistency that would have once seemed impossible to him. There were no dramatic breakthroughs now, no moments of revelation shouted into the wind. Instead, there was repetition. Rising before dawn without negotiation. Training whether the body felt strong or hollow. Eating simply. Speaking little. Resting with intention. This was the eighth discipline in its quiet form, mastery of the ordinary. Kensei taught that most men fail not because they lack intensity, but because they cannot sustain it without excitement. They burn brightly for a moment, then fade. The warrior, however, becomes a rhythm. Teshi began to see that discipline was not an act of force, but of alignment. When every part of life moved in the same direction, effort decreased while power increased. Nothing pulled against him anymore. His days were not easier, but they were cleaner. Distraction lost its hold. Regret lost its voice. In this stillness, Teshi began to perceive the world differently. He noticed subtle changes in weather before storms arrived. He sensed tension in opponents before movement. He recognized when a moment called for action and when it demanded restraint. This was not intuition in the mystical sense, but clarity born from undivided attention. Kensei explained that Musashi called this seeing without looking. It arises only when the mind is no longer crowded with noise. One evening, Kensei shared the ninth discipline again, this time without ceremony. Accept death, not as an idea, but as a companion. Teshi realized that this acceptance had reshaped his relationship with fear entirely. Fear no longer whispered catastrophes about the future. It simply marked the importance of the present. When fear appeared, it was no longer an obstacle, but a signal. Pay attention. Something matters here. This reframing transformed pressure into focus. Teshi began to understand why so many men crumble under expectation. They fight fear instead of using it. They resist discomfort instead of letting it sharpen them. Teshi no longer fought these forces. He stood with them. The discipline of holding the line also evolved. It was no longer only about physical confrontation. It appeared in quieter forms, continuing training when progress felt invisible, remaining composed when insulted, staying committed when no one was watching. Holding the line meant remaining loyal to the path even when nothing external rewarded it. Kensei warned him that this phase was the most dangerous. When improvement becomes subtle, complacency creeps in disguised as peace. Teshi guarded against this by returning always to the first discipline. Each morning, the act of standing without negotiation reaffirmed his commitment. It reminded him that discipline is renewed daily, never stored. Over time, Kensei began to step back, watching from a distance. He corrected less, spoke less, allowed Teshi to govern himself. This withdrawal was intentional. A warrior who still depends on guidance is not yet complete. Teshi felt the weight of responsibility shift inward. There was no one left to impress, no one left to blame. Only the path remained. And in that solitude, Teshi felt no emptiness. He felt alignment. His life no longer needed justification. Each day justified itself through action. He understood then that mastery was not a destination ahead of him, but a way of moving through each moment without fracture. The disciplines were no longer lessons. They were his way of breathing. When the time came for Kensei to depart, there was no ceremony to mark it. No final lesson carved into stone, no dramatic farewell. At dawn, Teshi found his teacher seated as always, facing the rising light. Kensei spoke only once. "My work here is finished." Teshi felt a quiet resistance rise in him, not fear, but attachment. There was still more he wanted to learn, more questions he had not asked. Yet as he searched himself, he recognized the truth in Kensei's words. The teachings no longer lived outside him. They had taken root in his posture, his breath, his decisions. Kensei did not leave him empty-handed. He left him sovereign. Before departing, he reminded Teshi that the disciplines were never secrets. They had always been available in Musashi's writings, passed through generations. What was rare was not access, but application. Most men admire discipline. Few endure it daily, especially when it offers no immediate reward. Teshi watched Kensei walk into the trees and vanish, not with loss, but with gratitude. For the first time, he stood alone without feeling unfinished. In the months that followed, Teshi remained at the shrine, continuing his training as if nothing had changed. Yet everything had. Without a teacher's presence, each choice became a mirror. There was no correction, only consequence. If he rose late, he felt it. If his focus slipped, training revealed it. Responsibility sharpened his discipline further. One spring morning, a young samurai appeared on the mountain path, shoulders heavy with defeat. Teshi recognized the look immediately. It was his own, from another life. The young man had trained diligently, followed every rule, yet still failed when it mattered. He asked Teshi how to recover from such a loss. Teshi did not offer comfort. He offered truth. Defeat is not the opposite of victory. It is the test of your foundation. If you quit, it was weakness. If you remain, it becomes training. The young samurai knelt without being asked. "Teach me." Teshi realized then that the path had turned. He was no longer merely a student preserving teachings. He was now a carrier of them. Teaching did not make him feel elevated. It made him careful. Each word had to be lived, not explained. He began where Kensei had begun. Rise without negotiation. The young samurai struggled as Teshi once had. He negotiated with comfort, with fear, with self-pity. Teshi watched patiently, correcting not with anger, but with consistency. In guiding another, Teshi saw his own journey more clearly. The disciplines were not rigid laws imposed from above. They were responses to the same human weaknesses that appeared in every generation. Hesitation. Attachment. Fear of discomfort. Hunger for approval. Teaching became another form of holding the line. He had to embody the path fully, or the words would collapse. Over time, others arrived. Not many. Only those broken enough to listen. Teshi did not seek students. He accepted them. Fame never followed him loudly, but his reputation spread quietly. He was known not for boasting, not for spectacle, but for being unshakable. Those who trained with him noticed something unsettling. He never rushed. He never panicked. He never overreached. He remained. And in that remaining, they sensed the depth of his discipline. Teshi understood then that legacy is not built through recognition, but through transmission. The path continues only when lived, not admired. Years later, As Teshi entered his fourth decade, he finally understood the last illusion that discipline destroys, the belief that mastery is an arrival. There was no moment when the path became easy, no day when effort disappeared. Even now, rising before dawn demanded the same resolve. Training still scraped against his resistance. Pain still visited. Doubt still whispered. The difference was not that these things vanished, but that they no longer held authority. Discipline had not removed struggle. It had stripped struggle of its power to derail him. Teshi saw clearly that most men fail not because they are weak, but because they expect strength to feel good. The warrior's way never promised comfort. It promised clarity. And clarity often burns. In solitude, Teshi reflected on Musashi's final days, on how the master faced death not as an enemy, but as a conclusion met without regret. Musashi did not cling to life because he had not postponed it. Each day had been lived fully, without negotiation, without delay. Teshi realized this was the quiet reward of the 10 disciplines. They did not make one invincible in battle alone. They made a man complete in his actions, so nothing was left undone. When death eventually came, it would not arrive as a thief. It would arrive as a known visitor. Teshi no longer measured himself by victories or losses. Duels had become rare, almost irrelevant. What mattered was whether he remained faithful to the path on ordinary days. Did he rise when no one watched? Did he train when results were invisible? Did he hold the line when comfort tempted him to soften? Discipline, he saw, was not heroic. It was monotonous, quiet, repetitive. And that was precisely why it worked. Over time, men across the provinces spoke of Teshi as undefeatable, yet he knew the truth. He was not undefeated because he always won. He was undefeated because he never abandoned the path. Each morning, as the sun rose over the mountains, Teshi performed the same ritual. He stood, breathed, and began. No celebration. No reflection on past achievements. Only the present action. This, he understood, was the final teaching hidden within all 10 disciplines. The path does not end. The fire does not retire. It must be protected daily, not with intensity, but with consistency. Those who seek shortcuts will burn out. Those who seek comfort will decay. But those who remain, who practice without needing recognition, who endure without drama, who move without emotional bargaining, they become something rare. Not loud. Not flashy. But unbreakable. Teshi accepted that this strength would cost him companionship, ease, and applause. And he accepted the cost willingly. Because what remained was something no loss could touch. A life aligned with action. A mind unmoved by chaos. A discipline that did not depend on outcomes. As long as he could rise, train, and remain present, the fire would stay lit. And when his final dawn arrived, he would meet it standing, exactly as he had lived, without hesitation, without regret, holding the line.